Welcome to the Gaudium et Spes podcast, where every other week we bring you Catholic teachings and stories of faith from people throughout the Diocese of Pensacola-Tallahassee. Now, here are your hosts, Suzanne McNinch and Chez Filippini.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Gaudium et Spes podcast. Today is a special episode. I am over here in Tallahassee. Suzanne, who unfortunately couldn't be with us today, but we are here with an amazing guest, Dr. Terry Coonan, the Executive Director of the Center for the Advancement of Human Rights at Florida State University. Dr. Coonan, welcome to our podcast here.
Chez, thank you so much. Great to be with you today.
We are here to celebrate Respect Life Month, which starts next week. This is coming out on September 26th. So as you all probably know, October is Respect Life Month in the Catholic Church. So a lot of topics, a lot of great things to talk about here. Dr. Coonan is involved in some of the most, pretty hardcore work you can imagine as far as forming the next generations for this. So we are really happy to pick his brain. And as you're here on the podcast, he also has a special history with our bishop, which we're going to get to hear about from their time in seminary. So again, thank you so much for being here on the podcast. Doctor, we always start with Gaudium et Spes Chapter 1. So the podcast is named after that, which goes, the joys, the hopes, the griefs, and anxieties of the men of this age, especially those who are poor or in any way afflicted. These are the joys, the hopes, the griefs, and anxieties of the followers of Christ. So you are a follower of Christ.
I am.
Anything going on in your life that fits those bills right now?
Absolutely. You know, Gaudium et Spes speaks for all of us as the people of God. And I love that it's all about the church and the world, and it's all about the inherent dignity of the human person. It's what Gaudium et Spes has in common with the human rights movement, that the human rights movement, its very starting point is that same exact idea, the inherent dignity of the human person. It's why it's such a natural but a great privilege to be a Catholic human rights lawyer as well.
That's very cool. And just to catch up real quick, you are at the start of the semester or gotten in the swing of things? Have things gone well at the start of the semester here for you?
They have. We haven't had a hurricane yet. Exactly. Knock on wood. Exactly. But no, every semester is a great semester. Okay. We have great students and faculty. FSU is a great community to both do and teach human rights in. So yeah, it's another just great privilege for me to get to do that. And I've done it for, 24 years now.
It's awesome. Has the plight of the football team weaved its way into the students' hearts and minds at this point in time, or we're just kind of rolling with it?
You know, those of us in the human rights movement have to be optimists. As we look around the world, you have to be an optimist. If you're an FSU fan this year, same thing. You have to be an optimist. Things are getting better.
Yes, indeed. Goodness gracious. They have to at this point in time, right? Only way is up. Well, cool. As I said, we're here. Thank you for welcoming us, by the way. We're here in your HQ here at we're on the College of Law's campus and specifically at the Human Rights Center. We just wanted to get you are a parishioner at the Co-Cathedral of St. Thomas More. So you're Catholic.
I am.
We're not just here with a random person talking about human rights stuff. We're here with a parishioner in our diocese. Just tell us a little bit about your faith background, your upbringing, where you came from, and yeah.
Absolutely. Well, Chez, I'd be what they call a cradle Catholic in a sense. Grew up in a Catholic family, Irish Catholic family, 6 kids. Grew up in the Archdiocese of Los Angeles, which meant that you always had an Irish Catholic Monsignor looking over your shoulder. But I'm also a walking advertisement for Catholic education. I went through a Catholic school, Irish Catholic nuns, Catholic high school, went on to study at Notre Dame as well. So Catholic education has been a huge part of my faith life, and the idea that we take our educations to be difference makers in the world. And that's been, I think, the great privilege, the great challenge for me also. Again, I work as an attorney, as a law professor, but really as a human rights advocate, being literally at times a voice for voiceless people, and that is the great privilege of the law and of being a human rights lawyer as well.
I see. So you go to Notre Dame, do you have your whole life just planned out to a T, like I'm going here for this degree, exactly going to get my master's and then doctorate then, or did it kind of evolve as you were there?
Not at all. Okay. There was no straight path at all there. When I actually first graduated from Notre Dame as an Irish Catholic male, I thought, well, I have basically 2 job occupations that are possible, either a Catholic priest or a lawyer. I didn't know any lawyers that I respected, so I thought, well, of course I should study to be a Catholic priest. I did in the seminary there at Notre Dame, spent a number of years there. got to know Bishop Bill in the process, along with a whole lot of wonderful members of the Congregation of Holy Cross who are out doing remarkable things in that world of ministry. Even now, it's great to just still be in contact with friends and colleagues from those seminary years, and great to have a CSC as my bishop here in Tallahassee as well. But no, it was actually the seminary path that ultimately led me to Latin America. Okay. And I've spoken a little bit about that at our Eucharistic conference last year, but it was really an immersion in the Church of the Poor, and it was an immersion into the persecuted church as well. This was 1980s. It was the era of Archbishop Romero, where the Holy Cross priests asked me, would you like to go down to Chile and spend a couple years actually working, and it wasn't quite missions, but it was basically living and working in shantytown parishes that were there in Latin America. So it was a deep dive into that part of the mission of the church. And what really formed me was that in Chile, they had been under a quite brutal military dictatorship, the military regime of General Pinochet. It had been a torture regime. There were hundreds of torture centers around the world. And the church took on human rights work as a sacramental mission. That's what made a huge impression of me, to be a part of that, really, but to see that it wasn't just about preaching or baptizing or giving homilies, but it was about human rights ministry. And that made a quite remarkable impact on me on how it is as Catholics that we're meant to be a church not of the world, but in the world. And the really courageous mission that the Catholic Church embraced there in Chile, working on behalf of torture survivors, the families of the disappeared, many of the victims of that military regime that had been quite brutal and quite rigorous for 17 years. So it was a quite powerful reminder to me of how the church can be a force for good in the world, and how important it is that the church be a voice in concrete political situations where there is persecution, literally hearing the cry of the poor. So very, very strong formation years for me ultimately led me to the human rights law field. That though I loved the world of pastoral ministry, I did feel a call when I thought of the refugees or the torture survivors that I had worked with, many of them young people my own age, feeling the call really to be a voice for them. When I later returned to the United States, ultimately went on for law school for a human rights law degree, with the focus for me being, how can I actually contribute to that kind of human rights mission? And again, I've found tremendous support from the Catholic Church over the years, that not just in concrete situations like Chile or countless other places where the church stands in the face of persecution, but where there's a theoretical framework for doing that kind of work. Catholic social teachings, one of the great parts of our Catholic Church. I wake up to it every morning. I think it might be our best kept secret in some ways, but it's just such a great theoretical framework for doing human rights work, for building up people, for actually serving as a voice at times for people that desperately need someone to be their voice. And the Catholic Church, with both its consistency, but also with really kind of the lived wisdom over the ages that informs Catholic social teaching, and the absolute consistency of it as well, that when we talk about being a right-to-life church, it's not a single issue. It's important that we actually be advocates against abortion, but that we also be advocates against capital punishment. We advocate for the quality of life for the very, very poor and for people across the spectrum. What I have loved about Catholic social teachings is both its breadth, but also its absolute consistency in terms of I can't think of a better philosophical system for basically advocating for life. I'm just such a huge believer in the Catholic Church mission, and for, again, what a difference it's made in my own life as well, obviously.
And you experience it, right? So the breadth of Catholic social teaching is not a theoretical exercise. It's to ultimately protect life. And of course, the issue that we're experiencing in the state of Florida right now with the Amendment 4 process and stuff, we advocate to protect innocence from this impact, right? But you were already mentioning your experience in South America. The reason why this has to go beyond the single issue is there's a lot of things that fundamentally alter innocent people's lives. You mentioned this kind of torture regime and stuff. And you yourself personally experienced this. You don't have to go into every detail, but the devastation that you're not protected by the government, but you're sometimes a victim of the government and stuff, why the church has to intervene here. I don't know if you can explain that a little bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, part of my experience that I hadn't signed up for, but was being detained by the secret police in Chile and being badly tortured. There had been an assassination attempt on the general, and the presumption was that it was Catholic seminarians that had been responsible. It was Marxist guerrillas. But that the church, very much a persecuted church, and personally, to be a torture survivor, strapped down, cooked up to electric wires for about 3.5 days, being interrogated. It was a reminder to me, and a really stark reminder, that this is why we need human rights, that in fact governments can't simply do what they want to their people. And that's really the inspiration of the human rights movement as well. It's based on victims' voices. It's unique in the law field because it is an area of law that's absolutely informed by survivors. I have my students read the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We call it the UDHR. Quite remarkable, short 2-page document that Eleanor Roosevelt pulled together on what are all the human rights that everyone in the world deserves. But it was the context of that was so important, that it was basically informed by the shadow of the Holocaust, that it was survivors of, again, one of the world's cruelest periods of time, and this idea that we can never do that again, and that everyone, regardless of where they live, what kind of government they live under, they're imbued with human rights. And it's interesting that the document talks about the inherent dignity of man, the inherent dignity of the human person, which is Gaudium et Spes.
It's the Catholic idea.
It's the Catholic notion. We're created in the image of God. That's why life is sacred. And that's why, for myself as a human rights lawyer, it's the Catholic view of the world that's so important. Also, the Catholic notion of sacramentality, which is so key also to our faith, this idea that we're surrounded by grace, that grace is there in the world. We have to seek for it. We have to basically contribute to it. We have to help make grace more real, more tangible. But that's also part of that great mission. And when I think of the work that I'm asked to do as a Catholic attorney, a Catholic human rights lawyer, it's about making grace more tangible in the world. And again, reaching out to people that are so often brutalized by systems, by military. Much of our work has been with asylum seekers here at our Human Rights Center. We've represented asylum seekers from around the world, about 90 different countries, probably at last count. So these are young women from Afghanistan being persecuted by the Taliban. It is environmental activists from Central America whose lives are threatened there. Young women from Africa or the Middle East who are fleeing female genital mutilation. I mean, a host of ills, a host of, in many ways, what are the violations of the image of God in the world? And the great privilege, to be quite honest, as Americans, that we're seen as a refuge, that I am a great believer in the mission of America. The whole idea that, what's the Statue of Liberty? It's, give us your poor and your oppressed, and we are a haven for them. And for me, that's why I'm such, not just an immigration advocate, a human rights advocate, but I'm a big believer in the mission of America and how important that is as well. We always, every generation, have to, I think, reclaim that. But again, Catholic social teachings are such a great natural framework for us to think about that logically and consistently. I personally appreciate the testimony of the Catholic Church on behalf of immigrants, that there's so many false narratives that are out there about, immigrants are criminals coming to our country. Immigrants are coming here to victimize us or steal our jobs. Nothing could be further from the truth. And that the Catholic advocacy on behalf of immigrants, so important. It's always struck me that in the Old Testament, the only mandate that we hear more than the mandate to welcome the stranger is to worship the one true God. And I think those two are inherently connected. I mean, that is the great lesson of both the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, but of the New Testament. Who is neighbor? And we learn that neighbor is a verb, not a noun. We're called to be neighbor for everyone we encounter.
It's always been, the Old Testament is a perfect reality of this. I think every Catholic feels this in the modern age too. Catholic Americans, the stretch, right? The welcoming the neighbor has never, ever been very easy for anybody ever in the history of the world. Israel gets set aside as this community, a tight-knit community, a nation of 12 tribes, and then God immediately is like, but you're not going to be just kind of on your own. You have to kind of keep stretching and stretching and stretching and stretching and allowing a neighbor to come in. So I think it's a help. The biblical lesson still redounds today, especially, as you said, in America, which is people are still coming, and they're going to keep coming and want to keep coming, and it's about our ability to stretch and welcome and stretch and welcome. I want to return real quick. So you discern to go, instead of actually going the path of Bishop Bill, being ordained, you move into family life eventually. You discern into this realm of pursuing your JD and advocacy work. How'd you get here, right? So far, we've been in Latin America, Archdiocese of Los Angeles, and Notre Dame.
I studied law on a human rights fellowship, and my first job after that was with the U.S. Justice Department. We call their honors program, but I was asked to go to South Texas and basically advise U.S. immigration judges on immigration law, refugee law, human rights law. I then spent about 5 years practicing that kind of law in South Texas. So it was on behalf of victims, and again, learned a whole lot about the broader expanse of U.S. immigration law. But that the heart of U.S. immigration law, and it's the heart of our human rights treaty commitments, is that we welcome those who are victims, so that whether it's our UN Convention on Refugees, UN Convention Against Torture, a host of international obligations that we take on for the best of reasons, because this is the best of America. And it was that area of practicing immigration law with a focus on the human rights remedies that are within U.S. immigration law that ultimately brought me to the attention of Florida State University, where back in 2000 I was asked to come and start an interdisciplinary human rights center. I'm fond of saying that human rights are far too important to be left to the lawyers of the world. Lawyers have an important role to play, but so too do social workers, filmmakers, folks working in our justice system, folks who are law enforcement. What I have loved about the mission here at FSU is that right from the outset, I was asked to start an interdisciplinary human rights center so that and we've sponsored probably close to 70 human rights courses throughout the university. So I teach a number of those. I teach a large introduction to the human rights movement. It has students from political science, criminology, international affairs, social work. We have a new human rights major as of the last year here at FSU. Congrats. I now have human rights majors taking that course. But the idea being that human rights should inform everyone's education and everyone's career. And that was the brainstorm of President Sandy Dallenberg, the visionary president of FSU, who actually started this Human Rights Center 24 years ago. He was a former president of the American Bar Association, a quite visionary man, and he was all about the law being advocacy as well. He was so keen on that, and one of his great contributions to the U.S. law field. Our law students, as a result of Sandy, they all do pro bono work during their time here in law school. Very important part of their larger education. But my roadmap, as it were, to follow was to basically create human rights courses, but also human rights internship opportunities for our students so that Our social work students could work in torture treatment centers around the world or refugee camps. Our film students could actually create human rights films. They've done films on refugees, on torture, on what's it like for asylum seekers to come here to the United States. Our film school is one of the great sort of areas that FSU does human rights work as well. But our criminology students going on, many of them working for the U.S. Justice Department, working for the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, working and making sure that, that understanding of justice really permeates the larger criminal law system as well. There's so many ways that human rights are applicable to what any student at FSU will ultimately do. So that's been the great mandate for me.
Fascinating. And this kind of leads into the question you already sort of answered it. Respect Life Month is this moment where our bishops call us as Catholics, every Catholic, to get involved on behalf of life. And I think a lot of times, through no fault of our own, a lot of Catholics suffer from maybe a lack of imagination, and it becomes not just a set of issues, but it's like, well, how do I be an advocate for life? Well, I can vote for the right political candidate or work against the wrong political candidate, or I can, work against the wrong amendment, work for the right amendment, or I can support in some way, maybe through donations to the advocacy centers that are doing good work in the law field. But I guess my question to you is public policy, or is maybe like the court system, is that the most effective place to uphold human dignity in, or have you found it's
one of many?
Okay.
It's a vitally important one. Much of my work is policy work at this point. It was back in about 2004 that our Department of Children and Families called me. They knew I spoke Spanish from my time in Latin America. And they said, Professor Coonan, we've just had a case break with over 100 young women from Latin America. We think they were sex trafficked, but they're afraid to talk to us. Many of them are children. They're 13, 14 years old. Could you pull together a team to interview them and find out what do they need from the state of Florida? And what we did not know going into that was that it would be the first research project that would actually listen to the voice of very, very young sex trafficking victims. We ultimately discovered there were over 300 of them. They were all young women. They were all from Mexico. They were all from the same city, Veracruz, and they had all been trafficked by a 72-year-old grandmother. She was the criminal mastermind. But what it represented here in the United States was the first time that victims' voices had actually informed U.S. public policy, that the research that we did, well, the FBI and the Justice Department seized upon it, but it did a great deal to inform, even beyond that, our understanding of here's how human trafficking actually operates in the United States. And it was of 4 national girls and women. We now understand that our largest group of victims are our own U.S. citizen children, typically runaway girls, often boys, but typically runaway or what we now call throwaway children that don't have a home to go back to. So that a great deal of our advocacy and our policy work now is in the area of human trafficking. So I sit on what's called our statewide Council on Human Trafficking, where it's heads of agencies, the head of DCF, Ashley Moody, our Attorney General, head of the Department of Health, and it's a policy body. And it's so important to bring human rights priorities into those kinds of policy bodies, also into our legislative work. I mean, again, the great work that our Catholic Conference of Bishops does here in Florida. Bringing the Catholic voice into the public arena is so important for what we do. We're not imposing our values, but it's really an ethic of persuasion. It's an ethic of saying, this is what's so consistent and what's so important to us. Our Catholic social teachings are... What I love about them, they're based on kind of the wisdom of the ages, the wisdom of previous generations that is kind of distilled for us so that it doesn't just happen to be what one generation feels. No, it's generations of distilled Catholic values that get brought to the table, both consistent and very important in a culture essentially of people that are disposable. I know Pope Francis has used that phrase, that we have to combat this notion of living in a disposable culture.
A throwaway culture, right? Yeah.
Where people are disposable, and so important that, and the most disposable, whether it's the unborn, the elderly, the poor, so important that we advocate for them in the policy realm. But it's equally important that our social work students actually, there's two tracks that they can do. There's a clinical track where they're going to work with actual victims. There's also a policy track in the social work field that I encourage many of our students to take, where it's to actually enter into that policy world, and as social workers, bring the values of the social work world into the world of law, into the world of policy, whether at the state or the national level. What filmmakers can do, what people going on for medicine can actually do. I mean, the arrangement of things, what people in our business community can do. There's no major, there's no areas, no discipline that we should not have human rights sensibilities in. And that's the great mission of our Human Rights Center here at FSU.
Well, it's a vast vision, obviously, but it's a vast problem that cannot be just solved through the lawyers, as wonderful as they are. Oh, Dr. When I first started hearing, maybe I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago, about this idea of trafficking, the immediate thing there's movies about drug trafficking, there's movies about illegal arms trafficking, and you kind of get a sense of little organized crime mafias, and then this phrase human trafficking, and it's just sort of like, I think for many people it's like, how does that happen? We fought a civil war over slavery. Slavery is illegal. You can't do these things. And then it's like, how does this happen? So I don't know if you can take a 30,000 foot view and paint a picture to how vast this problem is. What do we mean when we say people are being trafficked? And do we see these people? Do we see these folks?
We don't.
Day-to-day?
Oftentimes it's invisible. It hides in plain sight, especially labor trafficking, which we can talk about. But it was sex trafficking cases that first were brought to the attention of the U.S. public. And we have actually quite good law, both here in the United States and in Florida. A lot of my work in 20 years has been actually helping draft our Florida laws so that they actually better account for what are these modern day forms of slavery. One of the foundational books in the anti-trafficking field, very relevant for our Catholic notion as well. The book is called Disposable People, and it looks at how modern slavery is different. It's not slavery for life. It's not slavery that's race-based, but it's based on disposable people, people that are brought into another country, or times just brought to another area of the same country they may have grown up in, and they're exploited brutally. And it could be for forced prostitution, but here in Florida, we actually believe we have far more labor trafficking than sex trafficking. So labor trafficking, any kind of forced labor, whether it's in our hospitality industry, agriculture, where we've seen huge cases, hotels, where oftentimes the people doing the work are literally labor trafficking victims, that they owe a debt to someone. It's often debt servitude, or increasingly, and this is the work that we do with victims, it's victims that may have been drug involved. Many of our U.S. citizen children are actually exploited initially through drug involvement. Their drug dealer turns out to be a pimp. And this is a huge area of concern. It's a huge area of involvement for our Department of Children and Families, our Department of Juvenile Justice here. The recognition that many children that we might pick up on drug offenses are actually sex trafficking victims, that they have been pulled into that. They're, first of all, addicted to something which they then develop a dependency upon, and their trafficker then exploits that dependency for either labor trafficking or often sex trafficking. And then it becomes in a way to anesthetize them to what they're being forced to do. So that we're seeing an inherent connection between drug trafficking and sex trafficking. But what we're really seeing is this notion that people are disposable, that we're not seeing people that are held as slaves for life. Many of those young victims that we initially interviewed, they were thrown by the wayside when they became HIV infected, when they were no longer useful for their traffickers, because the traffickers realized we can always recruit someone else. There's this idea that when it comes to recruiting young people, it's basically exploiting their dreams. It's exploiting their hopes for a better life. That's always part of the pitch. That's always ultimately part of the lure before the coercion is usually applied. But we're seeing it in our nicest neighborhoods. We see it all over Florida. We're number 3 in the country here for reported human trafficking cases, which our legislators, our law enforcement, prosecutors have been very good on. They're mindful of that. But it's because of that supply of victims and at times the exploitation of really their hopes and dreams. That's ultimately what traffickers exploit. And again, I love the work that the Catholic Church has done. A group of Catholic nuns call themselves the Nuns on the Bus. They go to major sporting events or large crowd events to basically publicize that there actually might be sex trafficking that's actually being perpetrated as part of this larger event. And they're there to actually work with victims as well. Again, I love that part of the Catholic mission. It's not just theory, but it's actually doing the work of Christ there in the world.
Wow. And just I know when you spoke at the Culture of Life conference last year, you spoke, previewed this labor trafficking issue. Is our economy dependent on this reality, or are large facets of it, or is it disentangleable from? Anyhow, if you.
That's the dirty secret of the U.S. economy, is that we depend on the labor of undocumented immigrants. I mean, here in the state of Florida, they estimate that perhaps half of our farm workers are undocumented. Many come in, go back every year. Many have made a living for years that way. At times, they are also vulnerable to labor trafficking. That, again, unscrupulous employers or crew bosses, often it's the crew boss who is the labor trafficker, knows that these people are illegal. That can be held over their heads. They can be forced to work long hours. Their pay can be taken from them. Oftentimes, it's a smuggling debt, which continues to increase. The victims that we worked with initially all had been told it'll cost you $2,000 to be smuggled across the U.S.-Texas border. That's what you'll have to pay us back. Once they got here to Florida, these young women discovered that debt never went down. In fact, their traffickers continued to add to that debt. So that those young women, and it was quite brutal, they were forcibly exploited 30 to 40 times a day for sex acts. And they were all told that, each sex act goes to paying off your debt. But by the way, your debt has also gone up. We had to charge you for the mattress that you're sleeping on. We had to charge you for rice and beans twice a day. In this case, the Cadena family, the traffickers, they tried to get all those young women hooked on drugs or alcohol so they could charge them for that. The debt never went down. That the Justice Department realized when they looked at our research that the traffickers weren't making their money from the $2,000 smuggling debt. They were making their money from all the illicit sex acts that were being done, and that the debt was just a hammer held over those victims' heads. So very often it's debt servitude that we see, especially for foreign national victims. For U.S. citizen victims, a case that we had here in Florida, it was all African-American men exploited in Palatka. They were recruited from homeless shelters, and their trafficker was a former farm worker himself. He knew the system, and he basically exploited them, paid them in crack cocaine and in alcohol every night. He basically fed their substance addictions. He counted on the fact that they were homeless and that no one would miss them. And these were, for the most part, African-American men held for over a year on potato and cabbage farms in the Palatka area. And it was that debt that continued to pile up. So they were told, you should have earned $500 for the 60 hours a week that you did of picking cabbages or potatoes, but you actually owe me $600 because of all the crack or the alcohol that I provided you. So he fed their addictions and then charged them for it. So it was debt servitude that was actually being applied to U.S. citizens. But what we're learning, Chez, is that it's all about exploiting a vulnerability. It could be it's an undocumented immigrant, a homeless U.S. citizen. It could be a U.S. citizen child runaway. It's about ruthless traffickers exploiting some kind of vulnerability. And that's where ultimately it's about the United States better caring for victims, better prosecuting traffickers, but also doing better prevention. How do we actually prevent those vulnerabilities from being the magnets for traffickers?
So, my work in marriage and family life as well, obviously we advocate for the family for so many reasons, but it is the ultimate, like you mentioned, the homeless shelter factor, people without thick family ties. Then the family is an inherent defense, and the network of families that grows out in the communities is a defense for vulnerable people, especially children, in a way that laws can back up and advocacy organizations can back up. But without a family, a person can be awfully vulnerable to people without scruples, to people with bad aims. So
many of those vulnerabilities draw on a broken family background. And yeah, as you know, in your work, is working with families and children and that ministry here, that's such a vital part, not just of our church, but of our very fabric of society, that anything that we can do to reinforce that dynamic, so vitally important.
Well, Dr. Coonan, I don't want to, this work that you do, you clearly have a cheerful disposition that is still that has strong Bishop Bill vibes in terms of joy. You have not lost your Christian hope in any sense here. So maybe as a final comment here, just this some of the darkness that you see, but you still seem to be able that the relationship you have with the Lord informs your work and invigorates it. I don't know if you can speak into that process.
And again, it's the great part of our Catholic faith that our faith didn't stop at Good Friday, that actually we are a people that believe in redemption. Doesn't deny Good Friday, doesn't deny the anguish and the suffering that's out there, especially in the world, but that the experience of the cross is forever to be, in a sense, taken into the larger perspective of Easter Sunday morning. It's resurrection. I joined Bishop Bill in this thought that we have to be positive. Actually, that at the end of the day, I think it was Mother Teresa said it, that joy is the infallible sign of the presence of God.
Right.
And we live in a world where there's grace, where that presence of God is there. It's there for us to cultivate it and to celebrate it as well.
Awesome. And this Respect Life Month, especially as you said, grace, it's got to get activated. And this is our opportunities. We can be God's hands to be grace givers in a way that makes it real for people that otherwise wouldn't have been touched by it. So, yeah.
Great to join you in that mission, Chez.
Yeah,
absolutely.
My gosh. Well, guys, I mean, this is the Florida State University Center for the Advancement of Human Rights. It's not an official ministry of our diocese by any stretch of the imagination. Is there any way in which, though, people in our diocese can learn more about your work, connect with you in any way?
Well, absolutely. One of the great things we get to do, we work with anti-trafficking coalitions all over the state, so that if people are especially interested in taking part in that anti-trafficking mission, there are 20 anti-trafficking coalitions made up of community stakeholders, many of them basically faith communities, but also law enforcement, basically non-governmental organizations like ourselves, where we do direct work with victims. But locally, if folks are interested in being a part of Florida's anti-trafficking mission, there's an anti-trafficking task force. There's one in Panama City, one in Pensacola, one here. We have 20 of these all over the state. That's a great way to be a difference maker. If you're a Catholic, think about the great things that our Catholic parishes do as well. Just the outreach that's possible through our local parishes. They're in touch with the very local needs and the local mission as well of the church. So just another great way to be a difference maker.
Super. Y'all, this has been an amazing episode on the Gaudium at Spes podcast. We love highlighting people in our diocese that maybe we just don't know about that are doing incredible things. This is absolutely the top of that reality. Thank you, Dr. Coonan, for being a presence in the world, doing things in the world, getting your hands dirty. It's a fascinating experience you've shared with us.
It's a privilege to get up every morning and get to help build up the kingdom. So good, Chez. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was
All
really
right.
cool. Guys, thank you so much for sticking with us throughout this episode. We'll be back in 2 weeks' time. It's Bishop Bill's turn again to take the teaching series on, and he's going to be talking to us about the apostles. So we'll see you then.
Thank you for tuning in today to the Gaudium et Spes podcast. If you would like to know more about our podcast, please visit our website, gaudiumetspes.net, or go to ptdiocese.org and click the button that says podcast. If you listen to the audio version from an app such as Apple Podcast, Spotify, or iHeartRadio, be sure to rate, review, and comment. If you watched us on YouTube, be sure to like and subscribe or leave us a comment there as well. Thank you for joining us.